So I guess we can start. Good evening, everybody. My name is Kimi Raji, and I'm one of the organizers of this webinar. I would like to thank our presenter for this evening, Kilby, for joining us today and talking about facilitating distributed teams. This webinar is brought to you by Discovering Agile Community, and we hold this webinar every other month. In addition to this, we have a meetup, which is called Agile Dialogue Mississauga, here in Mississauga, Toronto. If you're earning SEU for your CSP, you can get one for attending this webinar or listening to it. I'm going to hand over to Mark for him to introduce himself and to tell us what he's going to be talking about this evening. Over to you, Mark.
All right, thanks, Kimmy. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so for today, I am not going to put my presentation into full screen mode because there are some things I want to be able to easily show you during this session. So you get to see a little preview here on the left-hand side of the slides. But what I would like to talk to you about today, as Kimmy said, is facilitating distributed teams. Some of you, I think, are aware that Johanna Rothman and I have released this book. The print version is coming very soon because I have copies right here next to me. Not quite on Amazon yet, should be any day now. But as we were writing the book, one of the many questions that we got were around the different types of meetings that Agile teams are involved in, and how in the world do we make these work for us in distributed. Oh, interesting. I just got a note that Keynote died. Okay, that was a false alarm. Apparently that was something else. So what I'd like to go through today is give you a little bit of my background and talk about some of the challenges involved in that. But first, a little bit of my background. So I actually started with Agile principles and practices as they first started becoming known around 2001. That was about the time that one of the first articles hit IEEE software. And I remember reading that article and thinking, wow, this is really interesting stuff. And then I got Kent Beck's White Book XP Explained and read through that and went, wow, this is crazy enough. I think this could actually work. And it did. And continued to try it in many different scenarios, including government programs, commercial programs. But the problem I kept having is I would always have somebody not in the room with me. And it almost invariably, I would have that through some of my early consulting. Several years I spent at Rally Software working with different Rally customers. They always had people dispersed, and then working for other companies as well. These days, or at least the last 5 years, I'm working at a company called Sonatype. I decided to get off the road as a consultant and become a full-time employee again. So I'm an internal coach, not really consulting at the moment. But the reason I did that is because Sonatype had a very interesting setup. They are completely distributed as Agile software teams. When I joined, they had one team that was Agile. There were 3 or 4 other teams that were not practicing Agile at the time, and that's why they brought me in. We now have, I believe, 15 teams. We are growing rapidly, so sometimes it's hard to tell how many we have. Those teams range in size from 3 to 6 or 7 in some cases. And they are spread all the way from Sri Lanka to Alaska. So I will share a little bit more about those spreads later in the talk. But also on the other side of the slide here, you'll note that there's quite a bit of activity with some of the nonprofits that I interact with. So I helped start Agile Orlando, and then later Agile Florida, a kind of collaboration between multiple Agile user groups. I've collaborated on many different conferences, and also am one of the co-directors for the Agile Alliance initiative for supporting community groups such as this one. And that's actually how I met Kenny, was through that group. And what I discovered was these groups were functioning just the same way as distributed teams and Agile distributed teams. So they had their own iterations in planning, executing, and how they delivered their learning opportunities to their communities. And so things that I learned on the left, I shared on the right, and vice versa. And that's much of what the book is based on. But what I would like to do for this evening is I want to back up a little bit, and I want us to think about what is it we actually do now for facilitation. And we'll get to that in just a second. And then I have 3 challenges that I want to talk about. The first one is, when can we meet? And you might think time zones are involved in that. The second one is, what type of distributed team you have? And most people don't think about that, but if you understand the types of teams you have, there are different ways you can approach the facilitation to make it easier on you if you are the facilitator. And the last one is, what are some other things we can do to make the distributed meetings better? So we'll hit on some of those as well. All right, so for now, I want you to think about, what are all the different meetings you have now with your Agile teams? And what are some of the goals of those meetings? So just think about that for a minute. And with some ideas in mind, I'd like you to go into chat. So in your version of Zoom, I believe that will be on the bottom bar. If you click on chat, you can go ahead and type your answers in. So what are the goals of some of the meetings that you participate in or facilitate now, just generally? Okay, sprint planning. Daily Scrum, retrospectives, right? Book club, very good, yeah. Stand-ups, yeah, PI planning, using the SAFE framework. Getting agreement from the business, yes. Discoveries, good. And planning and grooming. Okay, great. And the sprint review, right? All right, so now think about, in general, how does the facilitator help meet these goals? Go ahead and answer that in chat, please. Engage everyone. Keep the teams on track, right? Okay, very good. Stay neutral. Give voice to the introverts. Very good. Transparency. Time boxes, no biases, and being prepared ahead of time. Wonderful. So these are some of the questions I started asking myself as I was dealing with different types of distributed teams. Here's some of the answers I came up with. So as I was wrestling with this and figuring out, how do I support these teams in some of our meetings, I started first asking, why is it that we meet? So we want to align on where we are, so getting a shared context, and sometimes we do this in retrospectives, sometimes we do this in reviews with stakeholders or other teams, for instance. Other times, or maybe in the same meeting, we're setting new directions once we have that shared context. So in a planning meeting, one of you mentioned PI planning is sort of a larger scale version of that, but also in our retrospectives, we will take a look at what's happening, what we might want to change, what we might want to amplify, and set some goals around that. And then, of course, decide what are some of our next steps. And then I started asking, as facilitator, how do I help this process? So I plan the process, and somebody mentioned preparing, which is along the same lines. I also look at how do I hold the entire space? And this is the key one. How do you keep that space in mind and help others keep that space in mind so that we're equally collaborating? So this is not only giving a voice to the introverts, but also making sure the extroverts can say what they need to say, but get to the point and not, hold the entire conversation. Making sure that if you have people in multiple locations, they all have an equal way to contribute as well. And then also to inspect and adapt the meeting process to meet the purpose of the meeting. And as you start practicing as a facilitator, you learn to inspect and adapt in the moment. This is where sometimes I have challenges with certain tools, like the challenges we had today, because there's a certain process assumed by the tools. And sometimes I have to break out of that process as a facilitator to get the teams where they need to go. So hopefully that will set us up here for what we'll talk about next. So let's talk about that first challenge, because that's usually what I find is on everyone's mind, is when can we meet? And I find that it's not so much about time zones. We actually get tangled up on the concept of time zones. I find that's not really the problem. Instead, what I find as a better way to think about it is, what are sufficient hours of overlap among the team members that need to meet and collaborate? So what Johanna and I have found as we compared in some experiences, and as we were writing the book, empirically we found that 4 to 5 hours is sort of a minimum. So if you're working with any kind of Agile team online, they should have 4 to 5 hours of overlap in their day. Sometimes you have teams that have more than 8 hours of overlap, and this usually means they're very engaged in the work, and they are also very engaged with each other. They enjoy working with each other, they enjoy the challenges, and that's also sort of a boundary. You want to be careful people don't over-collaborate in those cases. But to narrow it for the purposes of what we're discussing in meetings, it's keeping in mind what are the work preferences of the individuals. So as a team sets up, usually one of the first conversations that I have with a distributed team is, what kind of core hours do you want to set? And we might have discussions on what's their typical workday in the time zones that they're in. Some people might like to start early in their day where they're at. Some might like to start later. And so you might end up creating a little bit of a map of the hours of overlap. And this will give you an idea of where are some of those hours of overlap. So as you see in this chart, this particular team, which is spread out across the US East Coast, a little bit in Western and Central Europe, they have really only 2 hours in their day, maybe 3, where they can successfully collaborate. So they might go into a discussion in their kickoff or their liftoff, or if they've been working a while this way in their retrospective, they might create a chart like this to look at how might we shift some of our time so that we have more hours of overlap so that we can collaborate, and that it's not a strain on any individual's schedule. So I see there was a question here in chat. Team members across 3 continents. not even a half hour of overlap. Yes. So that is a real challenge when you don't even have that half hour of overlap. In those cases, and we talk about this, and this is chapter 3 in our book. We tackle this one early. When you don't have those hours of overlap, you need to rethink, is Agile the right fit? So we're not saying that Agile will work for all distributed teams. There are certain cases where it will, and it's at 4 to 5 hours. You might have to apply some different approaches. You might also still be able to use some Agile practices, but collaboration is going to be very difficult without that overlap. Yeah, so please feel free to, you're welcome. And feel free to put other questions in chat. We'll have plenty of time at the end as well.
Yep.
All right. So let's talk about the second challenge. What type of distributed team do we have? So there's 3 basic patterns that I've come across, and there's some variations on this, but they usually come down to these 3 types. What I refer to as a satellite team, a cluster team, or a nebula team. So let's dig into each one of those. So for a satellite team, probably many of you are familiar with this setup where you have most of the team in one location. So here in the picture, you see person 1, 4, 5, and 3 sitting together. You'll also notice the solid lines connecting them, showing they've got some stronger communication between them. You also have 2 people at other locations, so person 6 and person 2. So these might be somebody that works from home. Maybe they were once with that co-located team. Maybe due to family circumstances, they had to move away from that location, from that city, but the team really valued their work and said, hey, please stay connected with us. And management also made arrangements, because they valued this individual, to have them work remotely. Or it could be another case where you have some special subject matter expert joining the team, or a contractor joining the team that can't easily be co-located with the team. So that's another example of a satellite person. So the challenge here in this case is you want to keep this communication strong here, but these other communication lines you want to strengthen so that everyone doesn't think of the team as here, but they see the team as this entire circle. So we talk about this as, where's the affinity of the team? Is it by location, or is it by the whole space? And as facilitator, how do you hold this entire space and not just concentrate maybe on the people that you're co-located with? The second type are clusters. And so this is where you have the team spread out across multiple locations. So you might have one pair or a small group in location 1, shown by person 1 and 2. You might have another one shown by person 3 and 6 in another location, and another by person 4 and 5 in yet another location. And certainly there's strong communication between those individuals, perhaps, if they are sitting near each other. They may not be in that location, but certainly the others are a little bit of weaker communication. So there is a sense of affinity, but how do you make sure it's even across the entire team as a facilitator? The third type is what I refer to as a nebula. And this is where the entire team is working remotely. No one is co-located. So if you're watching me on video, I am working out of my house, which is true for most of the individuals at the company I work at now. We all work from our homes. I happen to have a separate home office. Many of our staff do. And so we're on more of an equal level in this case. So we may not have as strong a communication as if we were co-located, hence the dashed lines you see here in the figure, but we all have an equal level of communication. In some ways, this can be a little bit easier to facilitate. In other ways, it could be a little bit more challenging. Okay, and then Room is saying that more than 60% of the people in her workplace are remote workers as well. So I'm assuming all kind of working at a home office or individually.
Yep, that's correct.
Yeah, 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 and that's very common these days. So how can you deal with this particular challenge? There's actually a few things that you can use. So we'll talk about the back channel, the buddy system, and using Copilots. So the one that I almost always use is the back channel. So we actually have an example here with the chat that you're using. I'm using that as the back channel. So we didn't set up any working agreement at the beginning, and I did that deliberately, about breaking in with questions, but you all tended to gravitate toward chat once I mentioned it was there. Most teams will do that. Once they know that a chat channel is available, if they don't feel they can break in on the audio or the video, then they will default to that chat channel. The idea being that I'm not only a space fan, as you can tell from the theme of the slides here, I'm also a Star Trek fan, and as I was thinking about the problem of how to keep the teams connected, I remembered the character of Lieutenant Uhura and how she would always say all hailing frequencies are open. And I kept thinking, how can we make sure that in our distributed teams, no matter where they're at or no matter what the meeting, all the hailing frequencies are open. They can always connect. So one of the things I will do early in setting up a meeting is I will say, okay, we will have this particular channel as a chat channel. So if you cannot break in on audio or we can't see you on video, you can always respond there. So no matter what type of team you have, whether it's satellite, cluster, or nebula, I have that available to me and to each other. And I will usually have somebody monitor that. Now, as a facilitator, I could do that and manage the process, but that can be a little bit heavy. So I try to introduce the concept of pairing in the facilitation, and I might ask somebody, can you keep an eye on chat for me, especially if you're new to using back channels this way. This allows you to concentrate on the process and have somebody else say, oh, I see a question coming in. Can we address that now? So you can pair with this other person to allow people who cannot break in on audio to jump in to the back channel. So one thing that I typically don't do, which we are doing tonight, is I don't tend to use the chat channels built into the tools. So here on the screen, you're seeing an example of Google Meet, and I had a Jira board up, and I was actually took a screenshot of this with one of the teams I was working with, and it's very rare that we will use the chat built into that tool. Very rare that I will use the chat built into Zoom. When I'm working with a team, I will actually have the team use their normal channel in Slack or Microsoft Teams or whatever they're using for a few different reasons. One, they're already used to communicating there, so they don't have to think about where is chat in this other tool. Second, when the meeting ends, the conversation from that chat tends to disappear. Now, I know most of these tools will save the chat, but is there an easy way for the team to get to that chat log? Usually not, unless somebody's very diligent in saving that to where the team can get to it later. So by encouraging the team to use their normal chat channel as the back channel, they have a history of that conversation. They don't have to separate it from everything else they do. So my teams do this all the time, where they have their normal chat channel as the back channel, and they're using meeting tools and sometimes multiple tools during the meeting, but you can get a flow of the meeting, even if you come in late, by tuning into the normal team chat channel. All right, and I see that Susan was agreeing on having somebody help monitor that. Yes, absolutely. All right. So another benefit is if you have people that accidentally drop out of the meeting, they can, notify you through that back channel. If you're using the in-meeting chat tool, you have no way to do that. So right now, if some of you were to drop, I would have no idea. But if we were using a separate chat tool, I would get maybe a message like, oh, I lost the signal, or I lost the meeting invite, I'll be right back. But another advantage of this is when the meeting tool service itself dies out, if you have another meeting tool available, most of my teams have 2, sometimes 3. So they might have Google Meet, and they might have Zoom, or they might have Join Me and Zoom and Google Meet. So what this allows them to do is, if they're using that normal team channel as the back channel, if the meeting service dies, they'll say, oh, let's flip over to Google Meet. Most of my teams can recover from a meeting tool failure in under 2 minutes, sometimes much faster. So this is no different than getting bumped from a conference room if you were co-located. So by getting into that habit of using that back channel, your teams can keep going with their very valuable collaboration time within those hours of overlap. All right, so let's talk about the next technique, and this is the buddy system, and I already kind of alluded to it a little bit. So I typically use this technique with satellite teams. So if you recall, satellite teams are where most of the people are in one location, and you might have one or a few that are remote. So in this case, what I will typically do is I will ask at the beginning of the meeting, is there somebody who can pair up with each remote individual? So I will not give this to one person in the room. I'll ask multiple people in the room to pair up with as many people that are remote. So what this does is it keeps multiple people engaged with the remote people. Also, I find usually it's somebody who already has a stronger connection to that individual. So they tend to pay attention to that person's connectivity or presence in the meeting anyway. So as part of that, we'll set a way, what's the best way for you to stay connected to your remote buddy? So if they don't have a team back channel, is it using text messages or something else? But if we have that back channel, I'll just ask the buddy to monitor that for that particular person. And if they're having issues, it's up to the in-room buddy to say, hey, somebody's having issues, they're going to try something, and we just need to do a quick sound check or something else. Or if we have some in-room activities going on with everyone else co-located, that in-room buddy is the proxy or the representative for the person who's remote. So if we were doing some kind of brainstorming session where we were gathering ideas, then the buddies would collaborate, and they would write up their index cards together, so to speak. And then the person in the room would post for themselves and for their remote buddy. Also, most people these days have a cell phone. And so when they are co-located, they can take pictures for their buddy and share those pictures with the remote person if it's not easy to see that through the meeting tool. So this allows multiple people to kind of help you with the facilitation. So this is a little bit of a pairing, almost like mobbing of your facilitation process. Another variation on that is what I refer to as copilots. So with copilots, you have somebody at one of the other locations that actually helps you facilitate the meeting. So this might be somebody that has some facilitation training, or maybe somebody you've worked with to get some basic understanding of what you need to do in the meeting and how they can help you out. So I typically do this in cluster situations where I might have multiple locations and a few people in each location, and I will ask a person in each location to be a co-pilot. So that way, each location has somebody that is being aware of body language in that location, anyone that might be having difficulties in that location as well. There's some variations on this. So it could be where we're all equally facilitating. So I've done this with multiple Agile coaches and Scrum Masters, where we might be taking turns with different parts of, say, a retrospective. Another variation is a host-producer role, where perhaps one person is playing the role of host or main facilitator, and the Copilot is handling a lot of the technical details, so making sure that people can connect or helping them troubleshoot connections. This tends to work well in large reviews or larger meetings. And then we already talked about the main facilitator and site cluster facilitators. This one, though, requires a bit of prep. So you want to have some time in advance, especially with your larger meetings, to work with your co-pilots. The first is, I would recommend co-developing an agenda with him. If you are the lead facilitator, you might have a rough sketch, but try to spend time with your co-pilots so they feel that they have a little bit of a stake in the facilitation, and they can provide some ideas, especially ideas on how to facilitate that works well for their location. Also, you might want to practice any transitions if you are actually co-facilitating. So if one person in one location is doing part of the meeting and then transitioning to the next, you might want to do a little practice depending on what tools you're using. Another good thing to practice is, if somebody drops as a facilitator, how do you do that handoff from pilot to co-pilot? What might that look like? What might you tell the rest of the group as part of that? It's good to have that in hand. Once you've done a couple of these, some of this becomes actually second nature for you and your co-pilots, but still I would allow some prep time to get this set up. All right, let's talk about the last challenge here, challenge 3. So how do we actually make these better? You still need good facilitation skills. There is no way around that. So if you're not familiar with how to craft a purpose that is meaningful and that the participants understand, or you're not familiar with how to put together an agenda and work with your stakeholders, or how you appropriately use a parking lot or action plans or working agreements, I find everyone can benefit from facilitation training. And there's many good courses, both online and in person. I actually had several years of face-to-face facilitation practice and took some training, and actually used to teach a facilitation course. So I had quite a bit of time involved in understanding how these different tools worked in facilitation and how you might rearrange them. So you can think of this, if you're familiar with the concept of shu-ha-ri. With shu, you learn the basics of how you work with these different facilitation tools. Ha, you start to figure out how you can rearrange them a little bit. And ri is maybe the case of where you would do something very different, but follow the spirit of what's intended behind some of these facilitation tools and practices. So strongly recommend facilitation training if you haven't had it before. Also, I would recommend taking advantage of your distributed environment. So what I mean by this is, if you have meetings that have many parts to them, and so a retrospective is one example, there might be things that you can do asynchronous as well as synchronous. So as an example here, I have a typical 5-step agenda. If you've read the Agile Retrospectives book by Diana Larson and Nestor Derby, they were the ones that introduced this model, and I've used it for many years. There's parts of this that I will do together with the team, and parts that the team will do asynchronously. So often I will introduce elements of the working agreements, the agenda, and I might even do a little bit of the data gathering as an asynchronous opportunity. One, this allows us more time to get into parts of the meeting that really require exploration and discussion, and sometimes debate. So conflict usually will happen in meetings like your retrospective, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, if you've had facilitation training, you'll realize that healthy conflict is part of a very successful meeting. So you want to maximize the time, especially the short amount of time your distributed team has, to go through that conflict, and you as facilitator help guide them through that conflict. And so things that can be used as data gathering activities or simpler activities in something like a retrospective, I'll have the teams do asynchronously. Also for things like reflecting on the retrospective and how it worked for them, I will sometimes do later as a survey, or I might go to the team's stand-up the next day. And I'll let them know at the end of the retro, I want you to think about how this retro went. I'll be in your stand-up tomorrow. Let's talk about what you might change for the next retro. So this gives them time to think. Also, somebody had mentioned earlier about supporting the introverts. Introverts need that time to process. I am definitely in that camp. So sometimes giving a response in the spur of the moment can be challenging for an introvert. So giving them that little extra time to gather data or to reflect on how something like the retrospective went can be valuable for them. And that, again, this allows time for things like generating the insights and figuring out how we want to move forward on what we learn from those insights. Those are the parts you want to keep synchronous. So just as a little bit of a recap, for the challenge of when can we meet, I strongly suggest mapping out those hours of overlap. For determining how to optimize the type of team that you have, once you understand the type of team, you can use back channels, buddies, copilots, and sometimes in combination depending on the size of the meeting. So your larger scaled Agile framework or less meetings, you might use a combination of these. And also for when we're trying to figure out how to make these meetings flow a little more easily, you still need those good facilitation techniques to keep the meeting participants not only on track, but really engaged in the conversation. So with good facilitation practice, you can keep them engaged. And by also making them aware of how you're using asynchronous and synchronous collaboration to be respectful of their time. So when you let them know how you're using the asynchronous parts of the meeting, they will typically provide that information when you need it, and then you can have the more synchronous or the more intense conversations sometimes during the time where everyone is together in the meeting. All right. So with that, I wanted to give plenty of time for questions. And so, yeah, for references for facilitation classes, yes, I can provide that to Kemi offline. I'm actually pulling some of that together. So I will be happy to do that, Elise. Love this part. Yeah, sync work as well. Okay, great. Yeah, so it seems like we've hit a couple things. So what questions do you still have? And you can, hopefully the audio channels are open. Kemi, can everyone open up their mics, or do you have to have them?
Yes, you can unmute yourself, provided you don't have a noisy background, and you can speak to ask your question.
Okay. And yes, I will make a copy available online.
I have a question, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Coming back to the scenario that I was talking about, that it's really difficult for the team to come together even for half an hour a week. It's really challenging. One person in Europe, one in US, and rest of the team in Australia.
Yeah.
Do you have any, and I'm trying to put down some suggestions for them to run retros asynchronously. Do you have any insights around that?
So I apologize. I'm going to give you the typical consultant answer and say it depends. Yep. But the first thing I think I would look at is who's on the team and where are they located? So can you give me a little bit more context as far as
Yep.
developers, testers, product owner, scrum master, or coach?
It's a team which is kind of in infrastructure space, DevOps infrastructure space, and
Okay.
four people in Melbourne, one in France and one in US.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So the person in the US is what role?
They are all developers.
Oh, they're all developers. Oh,
Yes.
okay. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Their job is to keep our websites up all the time in one
Gotcha.
sentence. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. Is there ever a time that they get together?
Not really, not in last 1 year. They are a very good team, and my workplace supports remote working. It's a policy of our company that we do appreciate people from everywhere.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, so I have a few possibilities for you.
Yep.
So one approach is you have more than retrospectives available to you as a way to reflect. So some of the teams I coach, they have a very lightweight way of doing this. So they'll have their main team channel, and they'll have another channel for gathering improvement ideas.
Yep.
And what they'll do is when they have that stand up, they might talk about one or two of those things and slowly kind of knock things off that list if it's a quick discussion. Another option is when you can't do that and it requires there's a deeper topic maybe on that list, that's when you might schedule a retrospective. So those particular kind of teams, what I find is they have a very high frequency of those light touch reflections. In the book, we refer to them as Kaizen events. So a weekly cadence is sometimes very good to do that. Some teams might even choose to do it more often, depending on the situation or particular kind of work. If it's a DevOps team, for instance, things might pop up a little more frequently, and they might be able to reflect quickly and just move on. For the actual retrospectives for the deeper topics, you might schedule those at a little bit longer frequency. So it might be once a month or every 6 weeks. I wouldn't go much further than 6 weeks though. And maybe keep it to one or two topics, and that's where you might ask people to rearrange schedules a little bit, and you might even have them rotate who rearranges schedules to do that. Again,
we're doing that in some form.
Yeah. But again, it's difficult if you don't have those 4 hours of overlap. The reason I asked about do they ever get together, many of the teams I work with, they will get together face to face at least once a year, sometimes multiple times a year, depending on the initiatives they're working on. That time is also a good time for reflection. But what I do in those cases is we'll have some conversations online first to get everyone sharing the same context and making sure, are we seeing the same problems? Are we seeing different problems? From a system view, is it something else we need to look at? And this kind of helps them get set up for how they want to dig in and generate insights. So they might do some of the data gathering remotely, but synchronously. And when they come face to face, when they're actually co-located for a meeting, that's where they dig deep into generating insights. And they might come up with multiple plans or multiple experiments to try when they go back to their normal locations. Yeah, so there's a few ideas there for you.
Thanks, Mark.
You're welcome. Other questions? Oh, we got a long one. Okay. So I'm assuming Chanel, hopefully. My company has several offices across New Zealand and are just starting to work Agile, acting as the Agile coach for a project. The Scrum Master is a contractor based in Australia. Between us, we are using the project to help build our in-house Agile capability. Product owner is new to Agile, as are most of the doers, and they're split across the offices. I say we are a cluster team. Any tips on how to manage this? Yeah, so I would say the first thing, and I'm trying to think. So Janelle, you're all acting as one team. Is that correct? Okay. All right. So so my guess, I haven't looked up those particular time zones, but it sounds like you probably have 4 to 5 hours of overlap. Yeah, no problem. I can work with Chad, as you can tell, and that's why I'm speaking it so we catch it on the recording. Since everyone is new to Agile, my guess is there may not be an Agile training budget. I've been in that situation before. So if you are in the role of Agile coach, how can you provide those teachable moments? So I've done this several different ways. First, just get the team on the same page. So if I'm in a planning session, I might introduce part of the session with, here's how story points work, or here's how no estimate approach works in planning. Whatever the approach is, I would provide a little bit of an intro and maybe even some references. So whether it's handouts you can email, or the team hopefully has a wiki or some document that they can also easily edit. I find that's usually better. To put guidance on, here's the process we're going through, here's some variations that we might want to consider. And in retrospective, if we're finding that our one approach is not working and you're reading about some of these variations, or we've talked about them, let's use the retrospective to talk about something else we can try. So I do a bunch of mini lessons throughout for the whole team. And then for particular roles, I might meet one-on-one, such as with the product owner. And I might have some one-on-one conversations with that individual to talk about how they might prioritize the work, how they might work with different stakeholders, how they might actually get customers to interact with the team so the team has more empathy with what the customers and the end users are dealing with. So there's a whole number of things that you can work with. I might even suggest some books, and instead of saying, read this book, I'll say, hey, since we're going into this planning session, you might be interested in these few pages, and then we can talk about them a little bit, or we can talk about them more in retrospective. So I provide as many resources as I can to a team that's new to the Agile processes. It's slower, but if you're not dealing with a training budget, as Agile coach, then you very much become the teacher, and you're always teaching and looking for those teachable moments. So hopefully that helps. You're welcome. All right. Any other questions?
So, Mark, my question will be, if this was a training session, like you mentioned, will this be any different from what you've just explained to us? In terms of
yes, actually, it would be very different. We would be in our team chat channel. I would be dropping multiple links in that chat channel, so that so at least it asked, hey, could I have this in PDF? I'd probably be off. I probably would have the PDF ready and just drop it in the channel. That doesn't work so well in this particular scenario. But I would be basically dropping breadcrumbs for the team, learning breadcrumbs as we're talking about it, because you'll have different learning styles on the team as well. Some are audio, where you can talk through the concepts. Some are video, and you would need slides, or you might pull out a whiteboard to draw some concepts out. Others might need that additional reference material, and I've had team members where I drop a link, they start looking into it, and they'll immediately start asking questions. So you'll want to be flexible, as well as you want to make sure you have read that material. So don't just hand out reference material you haven't read, which I've seen some people do, so don't do that. So make sure you've read through that material, and you know what you want to emphasize to the team, and what you might guide the team to say, this section is probably important for you. This other section, you could probably skip it for now. We can come back to that later. Because again, you only have these short, usually short windows of time to collaborate with them. So help them and guide them on how they can dig into those resources. And as I said, we would be bringing in multiple tools as part of it. Yeah.
So it'll be more interactive, as if we were in a same location.
Oh yes. So and there's a number of tools out there now. As I was saying at the beginning, I had another tool which I didn't have time to set up for today, but I will be doing that in some future sessions. But there's tools like used to be called Real-Time Board. It's now Miro. There's many similar tools out there for retrospectives. You have Retrum and Scatterspoke and things like that. Those are great tools, especially if you have co-pilots that are new to facilitation, because many of those tools will walk you through the process. I personally find those tools challenging because as a more experienced facilitator, I will get a sense of, okay, here's the goal that we're trying to achieve as a team, but we might need to veer off the process and try something else for a bit to reach that goal. A lot of those tools will kind of lock you into a process, and it's not easy to break out of it and then come back in. So you have to pick the tools appropriately for the particular session that you're setting up. So as a coach or leader of a distributed team, be very familiar with what you can and cannot do with the tools you have, and always be willing to try out new tools. I am always pulling in new tools and trying them out and using them in different combinations.
Thank you. So that brings me to my next questions. You've mentioned a couple of tools, that there are a couple of tools out there. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, when is a tool so many? In order for us not to go over the people over tools and techniques.
Right. So that's a tricky one, considering we're talking distributed. So a basic toolkit for most meetings is your meeting tool like Zoom. I like to have the team's chat channel available, and depending on what the meeting purpose is. So if it's planning, I might bring in the team's planning tool, or I may not. So if I see that there's a lot of noise in the boards, and we need to kind of step back and look at what is it we're really trying to achieve and get rid of some of the noise on the boards, I might just pull up a simple drawing tool or a simple spreadsheet, like a Google sheet in that case, and say, okay, let's map this out a different way, or let's make sure we have the workflow mapped out in a way that we can see a little more simply. So I've done that as well. And I will try not to introduce more than one new tool per meeting, or actually for several meetings. So it might be in a retrospective, I introduce a new tool, and maybe a week or two later, if it's a different type of meeting or another retrospective, I might introduce yet a different tool if it fits the purpose. So I don't throw tools at the team just because, hey, they're shiny and new, but does it help the team reach its purpose? But at the same time, I try to keep the total number of tools small, because you can get overloaded with too many tools.
That's right. Thank you so much, Mark.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? All right. Well, as you see on the screen, you see my website where I continue to blog. I also have a newsletter that I'm launching that I'll go into more topics, especially this year, on facilitation. You can also catch me on Twitter and LinkedIn. You can get the book now through LeanPub, and hopefully in the next few days on Amazon. So that March 2019 timeline is still holding there. And if you are really curious on how we do things, we are hiring at Sonatype. So thanks, Kemi. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Mark. It was a good session.
Thank you. Thanks for being here.
1 second, Mark.
Mhm.
There is one question. I think she's
okay.
at, oh, okay. She's gone.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I know Darlene, and she knows how to reach me. So.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah. And Kemi, I'm guessing you have a mailing list through Eventbrite?
Yes, so this video will be shared with people who have registered today, and they would get a copy of your slides as well, PDF.
Okay.
Yes.
Yep, I will send you that in just a few minutes, and I will also have this deck up on SlideShare, which you can get to through LinkedIn and other ways.
Thank you so much for this session, Mark. It's been a wonderful session working with facilitating distributed teams. Thank you. And thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Kemi. Thanks, Mark.
Bye. Have a good day.
Thanks. Bye, and you.